because they are paid less to make profits. And then also Marx views on marriage as a marriage that comes under labor also.
Yeah. Means it has its basis. So marriage as a superstructure and marriage as a base in its class conflict, right? And division of labor.
Yes.
Yeah. What else?
Also, we discussed, we also saw briefly how Marx's ideologies are actually different from Plato's ideology, which was based on idealistic view, and Aristotle as a material, like we discussed how Aristotle and Plato are divided into idealist view and the materialism view. And materialism is not the same as the materialist that we thinking that we often in our day-to-day life apply.
Yeah, yeah. Though they are connected.
Yes, sir.
Right. And it actually goes back to our first year where we had a conversation about technical terms, right? And how, though we use them in everyday life in certain form, having certain kind of meaning in study of literature, culture, theory, social sciences, we have a certain kind of a definite understanding of uh, those terms, right? For example, the term criticism implies fault finding, but when we use it in a definite sense of literary studies as a discipline, it is more about analysis and pointing out the limitations, shortcomings, appreciating the strengths of a particular position. It becomes critique, right?
Yes, and also we see how Marx says that a condition like the capitalist condition will not change until and unless the whole until and unless it stops to suffice for the workers. So until and unless
Yeah,
a revolution occurs from the bourgeoisie class, this capitalist theory will continue to be there.
right,
Exist.
right. And in some sense is still relying on Hegel, who believed that the ultimate goal, the teleology of history, linear understanding of history, is about resulting absolute freedom, right? And in Marxist sense, class-less society or communist society embodies this notion of absolute freedom in that sense, right? So you can see how he is indebted to Hegel. Yeah, and then we discuss ideology. So what do you mean by ideology? Mansi or Saloni, what is ideology?
Sir, ideology usually works to hide the facts of an oppressive system of exploitation, and Marx says that it is a false consciousness,
Hmm.
and this notion is at the heart of
Hmm.
Marxism. And he
Yeah.
also
Uh,
he,
hmm.
you gave an example of religion as an example of ideology.
Hmm. Hmm. And what he says that the ideas of the dominant class are often that represent the interests of dominant class,
And the entire class. Yes.
right? And they are stated as if they are the interests of the entire society. So in a feudal system, the dominant class, uh, the ideas of the dominant class became predominant. And in a later industrialized bourgeois society, the interest and ideas of the bourgeois became hegemonic, right? Though hegemony will become a very different idea under later Marxist thinkers like Gramsci, which we'll talk about quickly. right? An Althusser. But its basic function is to justify this oppressive hierarchic structure and class conflict between the proletariat and bourgeoisie. And it usually functions as false consciousness, right? It creates a kind of illusion that there is no such thing like oppression in a particular situation, right? So how is literature seen? Literature would be seen from a materialist perspective, right? As part of superstructure, as embodying ideology and of class conflict, right? That is, literature is seen as an expression of class conflict. For example, the plays of Shakespeare talk about the crisis of feudalism, crisis of monarchy under the Tudors, right? And the emergent new class, as in the forms of Puritans, very often. So, Marxism as a set of analysis of text or literature would see then neoclassicism as a counterpart of so neoclassicism as an ideology becomes a representative ideology of the dominant class that was largely aristocratic, right? But Romanticism under influence of French Revolution would have a different class structure. So Romanticism is seen as an ideology of the bourgeoisie, and very often there is a critique of the predominant ideology. So Romanticism is a critique of a predominant ideology by the same class of, and this connects to the idea of contradiction, which results in progress. So Romanticism was a critique of urban, materialistic, pragmatic, rationalist philosophy, which was mainstream during Enlightenment. So Romanticism was a critique of mainstream ideology. And that is what is also connecting modernism with Romanticism, because modernism is also a critique of mainstream ideology. Yeah. Neoclassical period is the ideology of neoclassical time is largely an expression of that dominant class at that time. And neoclassical values of literature are correlated to what should I say? The ideas of the predominant section of the society, which was largely aristocratic, right? And you see that in Sir Philip Sidney as well, as a new aristocracy, which is trying to counter the new bourgeoisie, which is represented by Stephen Gosson, right? So he's trying to preserve the domain of aesthetic and art as an autonomous, elevated field against the attack by Stephen Gosson. So what we are doing is we are using new Marxist ideas for analysis of literature, right? Novel is often seen as an expression of a new worldview produced by a new class, which is secular, materialistic, this worldly, producing narratives like Don Quixote and Robinson Crusoe and others, the early novel, right? So unlike romance in aristocratic time, represented feudal outlook, and the King Arthur and its knights, and romance was that kind of genre, if you remember, right? Epic was largely an expression of the feudal values of those period. Predominant sections of society in feudal system, the kings, the noblemen, the dukes and the duchess and whatnot, right? So novel becomes an expression of the bourgeoisie. So that is, we are trying to connect how Marxists would read literature. Right? They would look at literature as an embodiment of class conflict, where articulation of predominant class is often critiqued by writers as well. So romanticism in some sense can be seen as both expression of dominant class but also a critique of mainstream ideas, right? And that is the contradiction, and contradiction is a good thing according to Hegel. Yeah, the bourgeoisie in industrialized capital, that is the predominant class. Yes. The owner class, right? Petty bourgeoisie are the smaller rich. So bourgeoisie is the people who own factories and all those. Well, petty bourgeois are the smaller businessmen. We do look at trends from the top, but also how literature critiques those mainstream trends. So literature, because it involves contradictions and conflicts. So literature is not a univocal expression of dominant ideology, but it also has a critique of those values very often. Right? Jaldi. Like modernism, right? Also involves critique of modernity, the industrialized, nationalist, uh, bourgeoisie of the time, modernity of that time. Yeah. Another important aspect that they emphasize is that literature itself is commodity and is related to market. So this is very unromantic, right? That literature is seen as a product of a genius in a semi-autonomous sphere, but they would emphasize how markets in literature as commodity is also very important. People publish books so that they can earn some money out of it, right? So novelists would write novels in order to make money very often. So literature as a commodity also is a very important aspect of uh, Marxist view of literature. So they would look for uh, those things in literature which bring out class conflict and ideologies and uh, how it functions as a commodity. They would look at language also in materialist terms. And the questions of ideology, the self individual becomes uh, drawing upon Hegel. Individual identity or self formation is caught up with the social consciousness, the social. Yes, yes, Shatabdi. Market commodity. Not just popular, even all forms of art is related to marketplace. You don't see literature as completely independent of market, right? So that is Marxist approach, and I was talking about the idea of self and how self is a
No,
social
sir, I
construct.
meant to ask
Hmm.
that usually literature was considered as higher, is placed as a higher value. But when we
No,
see like
yeah,
when we see pop literature, it wasn't. It was like categorized as higher and the lower masses. Usually, people tend to categorize like that. But when we talk about pop literature that are gaining,
can you come
uh,
again? Last sentence, can you repeat it?
yes, sir, I meant that usually people tend to categorize literature as literature and low literature. usually, I mean. And nowadays that popular literature is gaining value. Is it because it is seen as a market commodity because of its strong influence on the
Mm,
market?
yes, the distinction between high literature and low literature, it goes back to the heart of modernity and in the theory of Matthew Arnold, right? And how is high literature determined? When it draws upon the idea of the aristocratic notions of literature, right? So literature, when it's seen in the context of market, then popular literature has an eye over sales, while high literature has focuses more on status. So Amitav Ghosh has higher status than Chetan Bhagat. Not that both of them don't care about uh, these things, right? Chetan Bhagat doesn't mind being slotted as a low uh, art form. So, but this distinction between high and low form is a product of modernity, right? Something that postmodernism questions. But what you are saying is that the prominence that popular literature is gaining is not because of Marxist view of literature. I hope you get that. Prominence that the popular is gaining is because of higher levels of literacy and growth in market itself, market of books. So people look at books as entertainment very often, and it becomes part of entertainment industry in that sense, and that's why it is gaining prominence, because and that is why it is gaining visibility. But it is not because of Marxist view of literature being related to a market, right? But that is emphasized by Marxists. The market becomes a very important dimension of literature. So does that help you to clarify, Shatabdi? It is not because of Marxist idea that the mod popular is getting prominence today. It's getting prominence because market is now upbeat about popular. Yeah. And I was talking about self as Hegel points out, is social. So in order to be you, you have to contrast yourself from not you. So for your self-consciousness, other is absolute must. So this social basis of subjectivity, right? Material basis of subjectivity becomes a very important point of view in Marxism, right? So the subject, so literature as seen is seen as through and through a social institution related to economics and politics and class conflict, rather than being an autonomous domain as Kant and Hegel would insist upon. So it's a critique of this romantic view of autonomy of art that you find in Marxism, right? Uh, so on page number 535, these are the points that are mentioned here. One important point is point number 2, is that what we consider as objective truth is very often seen as ideological construct. Our view of things, right, as objectively existing facts are actually constructs of ideology. Whether that those facts are like, say, for example, the novel dealing with domestic life or novel dealing with religious themes. Now, all these things are seen as ideological. That is a very important point to be kept in mind. So these are some points that Marx and Engels insisted upon. page number 535. And language becomes a social practice, a material phenomena, right? So these are some of the basics of uh, Marxist approach to criticism, and we have looked largely at Marx and Engels' views. Now, later on in 20th century, there were various Marxist movements of various kinds of ideological orientations, and so there is a diversity of Marxist approaches. For example, you can have feminist Marxism, you can have structuralist Marxism, like that you find in Althusser, right? You find uh, post-structuralist Marxism, as in the school called uh, cultural materialism in Britain, that became prominent in the 80s, right? Or you may find uh, people combining several approaches, like Frankfurt School in Germany, right? During the Second World War, before that they had to run away to America, and when they came back, they started looking at what led to this world war from a Marxist perspective, but they also drew upon the ideas of Freud. So, Frankfurt School, based in Germany, involved people like Walter Benjamin, then Adorno, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Erich Fromm, right, and Herbert Marcuse. These are all German philosophers associated with Frankfurt School, and the latest one is Habermas, who is one of the most prominent thinkers of modernity today. But all these scholars don't accept Marxism as a kind of ultimate truth, right? They would take important aspects of Marxist ideas, combine it with other ideas. Like, first they combined it with Freud's idea. Freud also was a German thinker, right? And uh, then in Italy, you had a person called Antonio Gramsci, who is probably most influential Marxist of 20th century. And Gramsci uh, was in prison, and he was trying to explain why the proletariat or the exploited people don't unite to bring down uh, capitalism, right? So he's trying to explain why Marx's prophecy has failed, right? So in 1920s, let me see, which page number 542. Uh, so Antonio Gramsci is trying to explain why people don't rise up in uh, revolution. Why do people who are oppressed continue being oppressed rather than fighting against oppression? The workers. So why do workers not rebel, right? And the theory that he provides is this, that the ideology, and that's why ideology becomes a prominent feature of 20th century Marxism, that ideology is not imposed upon through force. It's not that the capitalist would force the workers to accept their ideas and their interests, right? What they would do is rather persuade and convince the intellectuals of worker class to accept these predominant ideas, right? So persuasion, convincing becomes primary mode through which ideology becomes hegemonic, right? So word hegemonic is not the same as dominant. Hegemonic is when the dominated accepts the ideology of the dominator. I hope you get, not through force. So if there is no force involved, then through educational institutions, through writings, through literature, the ideas of capitalist class become naturalized, right? And the workers accept these ideas as natural. And this accepting the ideas of the oppressors, right, is called hegemony. And that is achieved not through force. Because if you use force, then usually people will rebel. I hope you get what I'm saying. So the capitalist class uses all sorts of devices, all sorts of mechanisms to spread their ideology without force, through media, through education, through religious preachers, through influential people, right? So he makes a distinction between organic intellectuals, who are intellectuals of who represent that particular section and the interests of that particular sections, right? And intellectuals are not the same as philosophers or academicians. Intellectuals are the people, in Gramscian terms, who represent that section. So organic intellectuals, say for example in workers, would be the workers who are aware of their interests, rights of and interests of workers. So such people, right, play a prominent role in establishment of hegemony. That is what Gramsci is saying. So later philosophers, structuralist philosophers like Althusser would build upon Gramsci. While Gramsci is Italian, Althusser is French. And with that rises the whole French theory group around Marxism. Yeah, what is the question? Organic intellectuals are intellectuals who represent that who come from that section. So workers uh, who represent themselves as workers, and they represent interest of that section. So intellectuals among workers would be organic intellectuals, right? It's not the petty bourgeois or not the capitalist who is speaking on behalf of workers, but the organic intellectual comes from working class, and that is an organic intellectual. Is that clear, Mansi?
Yes, so as an organic intellectual could not necessarily be coming from a working class. Like it could be ones from the bourgeoisie who represent their interests,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Okay.
yes. Okay. What Althusser does is he picks up from Gramsci and puts it into the state context, right? And uh, yeah, what is the question again?
So you said Gramsci gave two kinds of intellectuals. One is organic. What is the other?
Others are not organic. Means, for example,
Okay.
the elites who talk about poor people's rights, are not organic intellectuals. But poor people, or say for example, workers representing themselves and their interests, would be organic, who are coming from that class background,
Right.
right? Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So what Althusser does is puts Gramsci in a different, he reframes Gramsci and says that any state, right, any state has two sets of mechanisms. One he calls ideological state apparatus, and second is repressive state apparatus. The repressive state apparatus would be something like police and army and people who can penalize people, right, who enforce things. While ideological state apparatus is like church or like education institution or newspaper and media, And this ideological state apparatus functions to produce hegemony of the predominant class. So education becomes one of the basic mechanisms for perpetuation of hegemony of the upper class, according to Althusser. And Althusser also changes the notion of ideology. And instead of looking at Marx's idea of ideology as false consciousness, what he says that ideology actually has a productive and positive side. It produces certain kinds of realities. And ideology in structuralist terms is is works on the lines of situating people in the system, right? And he uses the term interpellation, where a person is situated in the system. So imagine when when a small child, infant is born, and you say a girl is born. So when you say that, when you interpolate that, that person's place in the social and cultural frame is decided. There is a pre-decided set of roles that that person will have to follow, right? And the lifestyle and the kind of things that that person can do and cannot do will be decided beforehand. So, and all those are realities, right? And these are not false consciousness. These are realities that that person has to experience. So one's place in society is determined by ideology. So ideology interpellates, and the term means hail. Kisi ko bulana, like policeman hails somebody. You come here, right? So when you say you, that person's place is fixed in that system, right? So according to Althusser, ideology has this function of naturalizing social structures, right? And positing and situating people in that system. So when you say, oh, this is a clerk, then that clerk gets that place in the scheme of things. I don't know if it makes any sense. And if it doesn't make sense, don't worry, I'm not going to go into depth of that, because it requires understanding of structuralism as well. We are not going to discuss structuralism. So, but I leave it at that, right? Another very influential school of Marxism in early 20th century was the Soviet model of realism. The Soviet Union had their own cultural policy, where they decided writers should write on these lines, right? So every novel should be a reflection of class conflict, where you show how workers are being, or peasants are being oppressed by capitalist class. And if you don't write like this, you will be sent to Siberia or jail. So it was the Politburo, as it is called, Russian Politburo, which enforced that all writers should write like this, right? Remember, they never believed in bourgeois democracy, where freedom of expression and freedom of thought, ye wo sab. If anybody did not follow official lines, then that person was sent to Siberia, especially in Stalinist regime. And Stalin, who succeeded great leaders like Lenin, would join hands with Hitler at a particular point, right? And he became one of the most powerful dictators of 20th century. And if you remember, during Cold War, socialists were favored by American because they could also speak against Stalinism and Maoism. So peoples like George Orwell writes Animal Farms, where he's talking about dictatorship, which is not just Hitler's dictatorship or Mussolini's dictatorship, but also Stalinist kind of totalitarianism, right? So during Cold War, people like Orwell were used by Americans to promote certain kind of anti-Soviet propaganda. But this Stalinism also disappointed, disillusioned a lot of intellectuals because he joined hands with Hitler, right? And so there was a growing disillusionment with Marxism after 1940s and 50s. So later Marxists would never accept Marxism in toto. Like Raymond Williams would not accept Marxism in this base superstructure thing. He would modify those ideas, right?
So,
So I think that's about Marxism. Yeah. कुछ पूछना है?
you said, yeah, you said Soviet Union had this policy that writers should write on these
Hmm.
lines, that they should reflect what is going on in society.
Hmm.
And then on the other hand, you said that they were not up for freedom, democracy, and all.
Yeah, so they were not in favor of bourgeois democracy. It was the dictatorship
But
of
they wanted,
proletariat. That, yeah.
but
So
means
they
they
wanted
wanted novels to express truth of the society, no?
truth, but that truth क्या है वो ऑफिस पॉलिट ब्यूरो डिसाइड करेगा. You have
Okay,
a right to speak truth, but what is that truth will be decided by the party, and that is still the
okay,
line in
like,
China, right? You cannot
yes,
go against official lines.
yes,
So many people who are suspected of not conforming to Marxism, like great philosophers like Bakhtin, right, and his followers, the circle was persecuted in Stalinist time. They were sent to Siberia. Siberia being the place where people were forced to accept Marxism, and they were punished through physical labor and hardships. So it was dictatorship, and that is one of the reasons why Marxism failed to appeal to many people. One, because of certain kind of sectarian outlook, यानी as if Marx ने कहा है तो बस सही होगा वो, right? So it became kind of uh, blind following, cult following. So if you look at the term Marxism, then it comes from that person. So it became a kind of personality cult. Uh, Secondly, it upheld violence, right? And that is a problem. And that is where people like Gandhi and followers of Gandhi would not accept Marxism because of it promotes violence. Even Ambedkar would not accept Marxism because it promoted violence, right? So that was another point where Marxism became a point of criticism and tendency to be dictatorial, and also kind of huge genocides that it caused in China, especially after the great leap forward, where Mao imposed Soviet model of super industrialization on Chinese economy, which was completely agrarian and agricultural, resulting in massive famines and deaths of people. And truth about it was never known. So these kind of horrific, violent acts made it less popular with many intellectuals. And after 90s, the primary political uh, expression of Marxism, that is trade union movement, somehow dissipated because of the new forms of capitalism. And so Marxism lost its political prominence after 90s. It's now largely in the domain of academic that you find Marxism, right? Very often. और बहुत बार लिटरेचर के स्टडी में ज़्यादा मार्क्स डिस्कस करते हैं लोग रादर देन इकोनॉमिक्स और political economy is the field where he contributed, right? And same can be said about Freud, that Freud is more popular in students of literature than in psychologists. Nobody follows almost today Freud in psychiatrists, right? So Freud is more popular in literary studies. So Marx is very popular in academics. So you find a lot of Marxists in academia rather than in political field where they were usually. Their leadership was in political field, but now you see them only in academics. So I think this is our discussion of Marxism. Yeah. Althusser said that ideology is not false consciousness, but it produces certain realities through interpellation. And by interpellation means a person's place in social cultural scheme of things is determined, right? That person gets fixed in that scheme of things. So if you are this is how you should live your life. So basically it fixes and naturalizes and reproduces the hierarchy and oppression and exploitation, right? That is what he said. Yeah, Saloni, go ahead.
Sir, until now, the kind of scholars and thinkers that we have studied, why do I feel that while we have studied Karl Marx, there's, I don't know, he said very less, he gave very less information about literature, and he talked, I don't see him talking about criticism as a notion that all the other earlier thinkers have talked about.
Though he
Like,
has
all I'm seeing
written
is, I don't know if
lot
it is
of, no,
politics.
he has written a great deal about literature, but he did not actually theorize criticism so much. Uh, so there is a book that I have called Marx and Engels on Literature and Art. It's quite a fat book, which I bought from certain Soviet publishers who are distributing it fairly cheaply. So, but he is not so primarily a literary critic. Neither is Hegel nor is Kant. Unlike Coleridge or
Yes.
Dryden or Johnson or
Yeah,
Matthew
yeah.
Arnold or T.S. Eliot or John Crow Ransom, right? These are primarily literary critics. Marx
Yes.
talks about political economy and philosophy, right?
Yeah, so the
And his
reason we are
ideas
studying
have
Marx,
influenced social sciences a great deal.
yes, so that is the very reason that we are studying Marx in literary criticism, because he has this huge influence of on all the other movements that are about to come.
Yeah, yes. For
And they
example,
are
cultural
associated with
materialism.
literary criticism.
Yeah, later development of literary criticism is deeply influenced by Marx.
Okay, that's why. Got it, sir.
Right. Yeah, Jelta.
So I could not understand Soviet Union of realism. Could you please explain that?
Yeah, yeah. Soviet realism is uh, a different model of realism. It says that you should represent the realities of oppression, class oppression, and class conflict. And literature should contribute to production of communist society. So it should uh, valorize, glorify workers, right? And it should portray capitalists as the bad guys. That is Soviet realism.
Was it successful? Like, did it work?
एकदम कंपलसरी था. नहीं फॉलो करोगे तो आप साइबेरिया भेजे जाएंगे.
And also, like just we discussed about Marxism failed due to multiple reasons. So, how did it influence the future literary movements?
They changed the whole way of looking at culture and literature. Culture no longer can be understood on Matthew Arnold's perception of culture as a kind of aesthetic, autonomous, spiritual domain of internal cultivation, right? Made to, uh, what should I say, to stem the tide of rising Philistinism, right? सोसाइटी बहुत मटेरियलिस्ट हो गई. लिटरेचर आपको it will help you in your spiritual growth. That's what Matthew Arnold would insist, and it replaces religion. While Marxism sees culture and literature both as ideological, right? So after Marxist intervention, it's very difficult to not see literature as an ideological formation, right? So the political context of culture becomes prominent in later what is known as cultural studies as a discipline, right? It challenges the notion of high art and low art from a Marxist perspective, and prominently associated with Raymond Williams to start with in 1960s onwards. And there is something called Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, which is deeply influenced by Marxism. And cultural materialism is another school which is deeply influenced by Marx. And these are more contemporary, 70s, 80s, 90s, aaj tak. Like Terry Eagleton is a Marxist, famous Marxist critic of today. Frederick Jameson is a famous Marxist critic of today, who writes about science fiction and the popular from Marxist perspective. Zizek is also some form of Marxism and communism. So Marxism still survives as academic criticism today. Okay. One more very interesting idea that Marx has talked about, I will talk and stop, is the idea of commodity fetish. And what he meant by that is that commodities, right, are actually products of labor and workers' sweat and oppression. But people see them as having some sort of intrinsic value, right? Intrinsic value. And people then hoard it because it seems to be a marker of intrinsic value, right? So consider branded clothes or brands of various kinds, right? To just possess those commodities gives you some form of social status, right? So what it does is that it erases the reality of labor that and capital that has gone into making of that product, and it becomes an icon, cultural icon of uh, the elites. So to have those things, you become part of the elite. So he calls it commodity fetishism, and this commodity fetish is an ideological uh, phenomena, right? So that you, if you have it, then आप बहुत high class हो, right? So even if it is expensive, you buy it because उसकी use value कोई दूसरे product जितनी ही है, पर exchange value ज़्यादा हो जाती है. क्यों? It is supposed to carry in itself some aura of superiority, right? So commodity fetish is a very interesting idea, especially in the age of consumerism. And people like Baudrillard, Jean Baudrillard, would criticize Marx on his emphasis on production rather than consumption. So later Marxists would try to change many core principles of class like Baudrillard, right? So he would focus on the politics of consumption, which is consumer society. So maybe certain literary texts also become commodity fetish. आप पढ़ते नहीं हो मगर ऐसे रखने से आपकी स्टेटस बढ़ जाती है ना? So classics वैसे हो सकता है. Commodity fetishes. Okay, so that's about Marxism for you. The other thinker that I want to discuss is Freud, as I said, right? So maybe we can start it tomorrow, or do you want to have the discussions starting today? I leave that to you.
No, sir, Marx has been very heavy. We'll start Freud
Okay,
tomorrow.
okay, fine.
And
But
sir,
tomorrow I will
could you
inform you at
please?
what time, right? I will inform
Yes.
you the time tomorrow. It's not fixed. But do you have any classes tomorrow? No?
That same slots are empty, sir. 10 a.m.,
It's
11:30 a.m.
11:30 a.m.
Like
to?
last time. 11:30 to 12:30, 10 to 11 is also empty.
Okay. I
Sir,
will
could you
inform
please
you. I will
tell us?
confirm that. Right?
Yes.
Okay. कुछ पूछना है before we stop?
Sir, you were saying in the morning class about the thinkers that we are not supposed to study from this chapter from
For
Marx.
not supposed to study, nahi, not supposed to study for exams.
For exams, yes.
There is
Of
a
course.
difference. There is no
No,
such
yes.
thing like no thinker who is not supposed to study. Sabhi thinkers you are supposed to study, but for exams.
Yes, those two important words for exams.
Mhm.
So could you
Marx
please
fetish wala ek naya, you can coin a new uh, term. Marx fetishism means आपके पास बहुत सारे मार्क हो गए तो it becomes a marker of some sort of intellectual cultural superiority, right?
yes, we could do that.
So I appeal that you avoid that Marx fetishism and don't be Marxists, right?
Yes,
Marks are important, but उसका fetish बनाना problem हो जाता है.
right.
Right. So we meet tomorrow at I will tell you either 10 or 11:30. Not at 2:45 because you have another class it seems. And next week, probably Monday, we will have additional mid-sem. So Titiksha, Chayan, and some of you have missed it, right? So I will inform you about the timings, probably on Monday. Yeah. So you have time to prepare. No, and the same syllabus that we had for mid-sem. Okay, so see you tomorrow then, and take care.